Now that we've looked at short-run Phillips curve, long-run Phillips curve, and then how economies adjust in absence of fiscal policy, we're going to take a look at the rational expectations model and see how these two things are linked together. And from there, we can use it to understand fiscal and monetary policy in a more precise way. So we're going to start off with an increase in demand on the ASAD diagram, and we're going to trace this through both the adjustment process with ASAD and then also how that looks on the Phillips curve above. It's an important point to note here that what we see on the Phillips curve is just another representation of what we're seeing on the ASAD diagram. So it's looking at the same thing from somewhat different angles. All right, now let's begin. So we are going to begin with a shift in AD. So we'll say that the federal government decides that it's going to increase government spending, and it holds that spending at a permanently higher level. So they are continuously trying to increase aggregate demand. So we know that the short-term effect is to move us to this new output level and this price level. We also know that the price level was expected to be lower, so this is some unexpected inflation. Now, as we saw here, a movement along the aggregate supply curve was also going to be a movement along the short-run Phillips curve, but in the opposite direction. So as AD shifts along the AS curve to here, we see a movement along here. So remember that this point on the graph was where expected and actual inflation equal each other. So this is what expected equals actual inflation. So that's what's happening here at the intersection of short run and long run Phillips curve. So as we have this sudden increase in demand or unexpected increase in demand, we have a change in the expected inflation or how we're reacting to it. So now we're out of that point where expected and actual inflation equal. As we talked about in the last video, that over time, people's expectations adjust. So in this case, workers would start getting raises because of the shortage of workers available. And what we would see as they get raises is that would equate to an increase in input prices, which would decrease aggregate supply. Therefore, aggregate supply is going to shift back to the left. So we have AD shifts to the right first, and then AS shifts back to the left. When the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts from the left, what we're seeing here is basically people's expectations adjust, and the short-run Phillips curve is going to adjust to the right. And now we are back at equilibrium. We're back to the natural rate of unemployment, but there's been a higher rate of inflation. In the graph below, we are also back to potential output, which is the same as the natural rate of unemployment, but we are at a higher price level. So this is how the long-run adjustment would occur. Sorry, I should have put that in there earlier. This is how the long-run adjustment would occur over time if we had an increase in aggregate demand that was sustained. And this is also how we would show it with Phillips curve. The next one, we're going to look at a decrease in demand, and then we'll switch on to supply. Okay, so we're going to follow the exact same process in this diagram, except now we're going to have a decrease in demand. So let's suppose that as a result of some monetary or fiscal policy, we have a lower level of demand. So we'll call this AD1. This means that we are going to be producing at Y1, which is below potential output, and the price level is going to fall from price level 1 down to price level 2. Now, we can say here that, again, expected inflation does not equal actual inflation. So we have moved to the left along the aggregate supply curve because of the change in aggregate demand. That is a movement to the right along the short-run Phillips curve. So we have moved from our equilibrium point where actual and expected inflation are equal to this point that's kind of further down the curve but out of equilibrium. And this makes sense. We should have a higher level of unemployment than before, which is consistent with a lower level of output, as we can see in this part of the graph. And we also have lower levels of prices, which we would expect to see as well. We'll go I1 and I2. So this is very consistent with each other and what we've talked about so far. All right, now suppose nothing changed on the demand side and demand just stayed persistently low in this case. What would eventually happen? All right, what's going to happen overall is that because of the high levels of unemployment, workers, as we've talked about before, will start bidding down wages, so they'll compete for the jobs. Wages fall, input prices fall, and that would be reflected or shown by an increase in short-run aggregate supply, which then will move to the right. And actually, let's go ahead and put the label in for AD. I'll label that 1 because it happens first, and then eventually in the long run we see short-run aggregate supply shift back. And we are now at our equilibrium point again, so we're back to potential output, but we are at an even lower price level. How would that be shown here? A rightward shift of aggregate supply would be shown as a leftward shift of the short-run Phillips curve as expectations about future wages and prices adjust. So this would again bring us to that lower price level, but back to the natural rate of unemployment, which is the same as potential output in the graph below. So again, this is just how Phillips curve can be used to explain a change in supply or an aggregate demand that's held over a long period of time, because we do know that eventually supply is going to adjust. Now, this is the major point shown by this, is that if over time you try to keep demand too high, there's going to be some sort of adjustment that we're going to have to correct for.